With our dashboard web part in place and deployed in our SharePoint environment, we're now going to turn our attention to another aspect of the SharePoint framework, which is extensions. And while web parts allow you to build out elements on the page, they're the building blocks of your SharePoint framework pages, if you will. Extensions, on the other hand, allow you to customize other areas of the interface. And as of this recording, there are actually 3 different types of extensions. And we're going to do an example of each one of those so you can kind of see the different options are available. But do note that extensions are probably the one thing that has changed the most in recent months within the SharePoint framework. So all of this is fairly new, and it's somewhat been in flux in recent months, and they're adding new stuff to extensions all the time. So let's try extensions out. We're going to switch over into Hyper, and we're going to create a new project directory that we're going to call Site Brand. Let's cd into that Site Brand directory, and let's go ahead and run the Yeoman generator just as we did before. But this time we're going to answer a couple of different questions whenever it comes up. Our solution name can be Site Brand. We are using SharePoint Online only. We're going to use the current folder, and we're going to leave the default deployment option so that you have to feature activate this by adding apps on a site-by-site basis. And here, instead of web part, we're going to choose extension. And as you can see here, we have application customizer, field customizer, and list view command set. So the one that we're going to start with is going to be the application customizer. It's probably the simplest one to get started with. We're going to give this application customizer a name. So we'll just call this brand. And we'll accept the default description. And it's going to go ahead and do its npm install, which is going to take just a moment. Okay, and we are all done installing. And as you can see in the message here, you might expect to run gulp serve and be able to see this. But you'll actually notice whenever you run that, it is going to launch a new window, as you can see here, and it's going to say the site can't be reached, and you're going to feel very bad because it feels like you did something wrong. But you actually notice in the web address up top, it's actually trying to access a SharePoint site that doesn't exist, contoso.sharepoint.com. So the first thing to understand about extensions is you don't have this idea of a local workbench like you had inside of the SharePoint Framework web parts. And what we'll have to do is I'm going to close this tab, and we're going to have to fix this by going into Visual Studio Code. So let's open this solution up, and we'll take a look at the structure. We'll take a look at what we have in this new solution that we have set up, and then we'll try to understand the best way to make that so we can actually view this inside of the browser. Okay, and with this solution now open in Visual Studio Code, you'll notice a lot of the same folders that we had before when we were working with web parts. For instance, we have a source folder, but instead of a web parts folder, we have extensions, and there is our brand application customizer. It has a manifest file just like we had with our web parts, and it has an entry file or a TypeScript file for the app customizer itself, just like we had with our web parts. You get your same string localization that you are used to with web parts as well, so you can continue to do that exact same pattern of updating the interface and creating multiple translation files for any string localization that you use throughout your app customizer extension. Now, before we jump into our entry file and see what it's doing, let's first of all fix the issue where we were getting the site not found inside the browser. So whenever you're working with an extension in SharePoint Framework, because we don't have the benefit of a local and remote workbench, what we actually have to do is we have to go into the config folder up here, and you'll notice there is a serve.json file. And this file contains information about how our extension is going to be served up and how we're going to debug it and test it inside of the web browser. And you'll see it has a couple of default addresses in here. And whenever we were running gulp serve previously, this is the address it was trying to open up, this contoso.sharepoint.com address. And the way you actually are going to test this is we're going to test this on a real live environment, but it's actually going to load in the scripts from this extension from our local host and kind of inject that into the live SharePoint Online environment. So I'll show you what that looks like. All you have to do is go and any page where you want to see this extension show up, just go copy the address. So we have this page that we've created here. We'll copy that and we're just going to replace this page URL in here with an actual URL. And it's basically saying, hey, load this application customizer into this page on our live environment. And you can have multiple entries in this if you would like. You have a default and then you can have additional entries. So what we can actually do is we can just delete this second one because we don't actually need anything other than that one entry. And if we go ahead and save this file and we jump back into Hyper, we will run gulp serve once again. And now it's going to open that page, but it's going to add this query string parameter on the end that says debug manifest file, and it has a local host address. And just in case somebody tries to use this to inject script, you do get a warning message that says, hey, do you know what you're doing? And in this case, we do, hopefully. So we're going to hit load debug scripts. And it's going to go ahead and load up that application customizer, which by default gives you this very obnoxious alert. As you can see here, I'm not a fan of alerts, as you can tell, but it's basically saying, hello from brand application customizer. Here is a test message. You get this dialog that pops up and I can hit OK to dismiss that. And that certainly is one thing you can do with your application customizers. You can show alerts to users. I don't know that there's a lot of good cases to do that. So we're actually going to do something very different in this case. But that's certainly, if you do have a requirement for where for some reason you need to do that, that is certainly an option. But what we'll do in this case is let's jump back into Visual Studio Code and let's open up our application entry file. So this brand application customizer.ts. And we're going to make a couple of tweaks to this file and kind of try to understand what exactly it is currently doing. So you have some imports at the top. You have various things. You get some comments here you can read through. But first of all, you'll notice that this brand application customizer has properties. Just like you have web part properties, you can have properties on your extensions as well. And we'll come back to these properties in a moment and we'll kind of talk about the different use cases for those. But for now, let's take a look at our brand application customizer class that's being exported from this file. And that is extending the base application customizer, which is part of Microsoft's NPM package that we've installed. Just like a web part, it has an onInit method. And in this case, in the default template that gets created when you first install this, it is doing some logging and then it's getting a message and then it's using this dialog.alert. And that's how it's saying hello from, and then it inserts a message. So whenever you refresh the page over here, you hit load debug scripts and you'll see there it's saying hello from, and then it gives you those messages there using a template string. So basically on initialization, this is where you can put in your logic to say when this extension is loaded, then do this. And in this case, we want our brand extension not to alert a message, but we're going to use what are called placeholders to actually inject some content into the page and kind of create a brand or a different style or theme for the site where this application customizer is activated. And the way we can do that is we can just delete all of this stuff in onInit. We'll leave the promise.resolve because this is supposedly supposed to return a promise of type void. So if you hover over it, you'll see that. So we'll just return that even though we're not doing anything with asynchronous programming in this particular function. But up here where we deleted everything else, we can go ahead and utilize this .context. So just like you have a web part context on your extensions, you have a context as well. So in this case, we have an application customizer context. And just like in your web part context, it has an HTTP client, it has an SP HTTP client, it has page context, and all that same good stuff that you have on your web part context, you're also going to get inside of your extensions. But one of the things it also has that you don't get in web parts is it has this thing called the placeholder provider. And what you can do with this is you can basically inject some HTML or some content or controls or whatever into predefined areas of your site, of your pages that appear within the site. So just to show you an example of how this would work, we're going to take this placeholder provider and we're going to use its changed event property, which has an add method on it. So using this add method, you basically provide it an observer and an event handler. Now the observer is the application customizer itself, so that'll just be the this keyword. And then we're going to create a custom method to kind of handle this placeholder provider change event, which we'll call just top. So we'll send it this.top, which currently doesn't exist. So we'll come down here and we'll create that. Private top returns void. And what we're going to get when we execute this method is we can basically say, let's first of all get our placeholder. So we're going to set this const placeholder variable, which is going to equal this.context.placeholderprovider.try create content. And that's going to accept a placeholder name, which there's actually an enum called placeholder name, which you can import into this file. And then you can see there's only 2 placeholders available by default. The word is that there are more coming, but as of this recording, all you get is top and bottom, which basically refer to the top of the page and the bottom of the page, respectively. So we actually want to, we're creating a top method, so we're going to use the top placeholder in this case. And now that we have that placeholder, we can say placeholder dot, and you get some information about this particular placeholder, such as its DOM element, which is an HTML div element, as you can see here. And that means we can set its inner HTML to some new string. So for example, I could put in h1, hello there, and we'll just go ahead and give this a save. And now when we go back and we refresh, and we load our debug scripts, you actually see we are inserting some content into the page, which is pretty cool. So this is a very common use case for the application customizer extensions, is to basically kind of set some headers or some footers for any site where you want to activate this extension. And this is a really nice way to add some continuity or some consistency across multiple sites. So for example, you can do all the same things in here where you could use web services, you could load React components, you could do pretty much everything we did with our web parts. You kind of have to do it manually a bit inside of the application customizer extension template, but you could do all of those same things. So for example, you could load in a menu that allows you to go to other sites and other site collections within this same tenant and kind of have that menu be centrally managed somewhere. And so you could have that same control be loaded into the header of all of your different sites where you want to use that. And you do have some new features in Office 365 and SharePoint Online. You have hub sites and site designs and other things that allow you to do this, but this is just another option, another thing you could utilize to create any type of customization to the UI. And the cool thing about this is this could be site-wide. This can appear on every page. So it could be on a page itself, which we're looking at in this case. It could be when you're viewing a list, and that's kind of the difference between your extensions and your web parts. Web parts are really confined to your pages, and you can really only use them to display page content, but your extensions can affect many more areas, like your list views and your other things that you normally couldn't touch with a web part. So let's actually make this a little bit nicer to look at. What we'll do is we're going to update the template here, and we could have a header element, for example, which will have an H1 in it, and this will contain not just a hard-coded text, but maybe we could actually insert this.context.pagecontext.web, which is going to get our current web or subsite, and we can get its title and actually insert that into the H1. And with that in place, let's add a couple of CSS styles as well. So we'll create a Sass module called brand application customizer.module.scss. And within here, we'll create a header class to style the whole header, and we can set a background color on that. And just like our web parts, when we were working with styles and all that other stuff, all the same things apply here. The only difference is your Office UI Fabric core is not installed by default. So if you wanted to use the variable approach, where you're actually putting in the variables like theme primary or MS theme primary or whatever that variable name was, you would have to install that as an NPM package first, or we could just use the theme sort of replacement syntax that you get no matter if you have that package installed or not, which is going to look like this. It's going to be theme primary, and then you provide a default color. And if we go ahead and open our Office UI Fabric styles and we go to colors, I'm going to go ahead and pull in the actual default color for that. So theme primary right there. So we'll drop that in as the default for this. We'll also set text align to center and add some padding, some top and bottom padding to that header. And with this in place in our SaaS module, we can now come in and say header class equals. And within here, we could add, we need to import our styles into this file. So let's go up to the top and we can delete some of these unused imports. So we can get rid of dialogues and log source. We don't need any of that. That was just kind of part of the boilerplate, but we could certainly import styles from that SaaS module that we just created. And now down here where we're rendering this out, we can say styles.header. Whoops, styles.header. And now if we save that and we refresh, you'll see here when we load our debug scripts, we get kind of a very different styled header at the top there. And it is actually pulling in the current web name or the current subsite's name or title, which is kind of going to change automatically based on which site that you're currently viewing. Cool. So let's add another bit of style to update our site title there. So we'll create a site title class. And in here, we'll bring down the font weight, as I usually do, to a lightweight font. We'll set the font size to 2.5 ems. We'll set the color to some theme color, which in this case, we can use we can just use white. So we'll use that white color. So that'll be theme white. Default will be a white color. And we'll remove the margin off of that site title as well. So we'll take this site title and we'll say h1 class equals styles.site title. And again, we'll give this a refresh just to make sure everything's looking good. And it's looking much better in our header. So we're going to keep this really simple for now. Just you can kind of imagine all the different things you could do with that. But to also show you the other placeholder you get, you're going to get add this.bottom. So we'll create another method that's basically going to be the exact same thing. So I'll just duplicate this one and we'll rename it to bottom. And then we'll change our placeholder reference from placeholder name.top to placeholder name.bottom. And with here, we're going to change the HTML to be a footer. And within the footer, we can just put something, like maybe like you want to copyright 2018, then your company name or whatever. So let's create a style for that as well. We'll come in here and we'll say .footer, and we'll set that with a background color. And this will have a theme color, and we can pick from the Office UI Fabric. Maybe we use neutral lighter. That one looks pretty light with a default value of F4, F4, F4. Then we'll set a kind of a light gray color for the foreground color or the text color. And we could probably use neutral tertiary, which is A6. So that'll be theme, neutral tertiary default, A6, A6, A6. And we'll also align this to the center and add some padding just like we did inside of the header. And then now if we add that to our footer, class equals styles.footer, and give that a save, you'll see it's also going to add a site footer on refresh right down at the bottom there. So you see that we get that copyright, just very kind of subtle footer that we've created. Again, you could put whatever content and controls you want to here. We're keeping it really simple and just have some simple HTML and CSS at this point, but you could really do whatever you want using these placeholders. And that's one of the really common uses and one of the cool things you can do with these application customizer extensions. Okay, very good. So let's talk about deployment because really with these, it's hard to test them because you have to specifically specify which pages you want to serve them to in your serve.json. So what we can actually do is we can jump into our terminal here into Hyper, and we can close that gulp serve, and let's go ahead and run just like you would with a web part. We're going to run gulp bundle in ship mode. And we're also going to run gulp package solution in ship mode. And just like we had with our web parts when we were deploying those, that's going to create a solution folder with an SPPKG file that has been created for us. And if we right click and reveal in Finder, we have that file now ready to deploy to our app catalog, just like we would have with a web part. So let's go to our app catalog site in a new tab. We're going to go to apps for SharePoint. And we'll go ahead and just drag and drop this into the app file here. And we're going to go ahead and deploy it and indicate that we do trust this particular extension. So just like with your web parts, you kind of have two ways you could do this. You have your tenant deployed, which our web part, our dashboard web part that we previously deployed is tenant deployed. But in this case, this is not tenant deployed. This brand solution that we just created, you would actually have to opt in to add that to a particular site. I think with extensions, this is actually usually a good idea because you may have an extension, like in this case, we're changing every single page on the site. So you may want to kind of be more careful about how you deploy that. If you do know that every single site collection on your whole environment absolutely must have this site theme or these placeholders that you've created in this extension, then go ahead and tenant deploy that. That's totally fine. But in this case, we'll kind of opt in to that. So what I can do is we'll go back to our home page for this so we can see that the header disappears. And then we'll go and we'll add an app. And we'll choose that site brand client-side solution. And just as before, we're going to have to refresh a couple of times until we see this light up, indicating it is done deploying to this particular site collection. Okay, so it looks like it's deployed. If you actually see this allow debug scripts message to pop up, it's because they use a cookie to kind of cache that on the back end. So in this case, if we know we're not debugging and we know we're not running this on the local dev server or the local terminal, we can go ahead and hit don't load, and you can just add reset equals 1 to your browser at the top, and that's going to reset that cookie. But you'll see now that that is actually deployed, and even though we're not running our local dev server, I am getting the top and the bottom placeholders on all of my pages. And if I go into a list, you'll see here those placeholders persist, which is pretty cool. Now, one weird thing about these extensions is that you'll notice if we go to what is known as a classic page, you don't get it. Nothing appears, and you're going to be like, hey, what's going on? There is a distinction in SharePoint between classic SharePoint, which is kind of the old version of pages and the old view of things, and then what's called the SharePoint Framework or modern SharePoint pages. And you're only going to get your extensions, in this case our application customizer, on those modern pages. So you would actually have to build a new page and set that as the landing page and kind of delete this devhome.aspx in this case to actually get that to show up. So just keep that in mind. You do have, again, that classic and that modern SharePoint pages, but all of your modern pages are going to show that application customizer extension that we have created. And for the most part, with a little bit of work, you can get rid of most of the classic pages from your site so that users never actually see those. And some pages you just won't get it. Like if I go to the site settings, so if I click on this link to go to site settings, this is just a classic page and Microsoft hasn't updated yet. So you're just not going to see your extension on this site settings page because it's been this has been the same for many, many years. It really hasn't been updated at all. But the good news is that's really only going to be viewed by administrators and site owners. And typically your client-facing or your user-facing pages are going to have that. As you can see here, they're going to have those extensions that you've created. Cool. So one other thing about deployment is that inside of your package solution.json, it actually has a feature that is created for you automatically when you have set up this solution. So you can see here, the feature has a title, a description, it has a version, and it has these asset files which contain element manifests. And if you choose to tenant deploy this extension, you actually have an elements and a client-side instance.xml, which are basically the exact same thing, but one of them is used for the client or for the tenant deployed solution, so where it's available everywhere, and the other one is used more for when you're just activating this on a single site. And you can find those files inside of assets. You'll see over here under SharePoint/assets, you'll see elements.xml, which this is for when you activate an app on a single site, and it's going to have its title and all this stuff. And then you have client-side instance.xml, which is actually going to be used when you activate this tenant-wide. And that's a little bit confusing, and honestly, you really don't have to worry about it unless you're using these properties. This is really the only case where you do need to think about this, is if you're using the properties of your extension, which in this case, it's just setting this default property that you get when you create this extension called test message, and it's setting the same one over here in this other XML file. So just make sure if you do need to update those properties, and you need to do it in two places, because it is going to use one or the other depending on your deployment process and technique that you're going to use. If you don't want to worry about tenant deploying this, then you can actually go ahead and delete the client-side instance, and you can delete this from element manifest, and then you'll just basically have a site app that you can create to any of the sites where you want to activate this. Also, speaking of these properties that are available, that's not really something we talked about a lot, but you do have properties on this interface, this iBrand application customizer properties. And those properties are defined in these XML files that we just saw. So if for some reason you wanted to, instead of showing the current web's title at the top of the header here, maybe you wanted to make the site title a property that you could then customize in these XML files. And that is certainly something you could do. Then you could come down here and you could just replace this .context with this .properties and then you're going to get whatever properties you've defined on this extension, just like your web part properties when you define those. The big difference is in an extension, your properties, there's no way to edit them by default. So you don't get like a property pane where you can just open it up and you can edit the properties for this particular thing. They're really defined by default in these XML files. So you can see here, this is like a XML encoded, so you get these quotes, but it's basically a JSON object that is defining the default properties. And you could do a couple of things. Like number one, you could have multiple XML files where you could have more than one custom action. Another option would be you could simply, in your onInit method here, within the extension itself, you could do something like make a web request. Maybe you have a list that contains the configuration for your extension, or maybe you have a JSON file that is uploaded on a site-by-site basis that's going to be loaded in on init. And then you could kind of have each site customize maybe its background color and its title that's displayed here, or all kinds of properties, anything that you could think of. But there's really just no predefined way to do that. It's more up to you with extensions on how you want to handle making properties configurable. Cool, so that's going to do it for our application customizer extension. In the next lesson, let's take a look at one of the other types of extensions that we have available in the SharePoint framework.